My husband thought telling me, "You are too embarrassing to bring," was just another small insult to protect his image. He had no idea Eve, the very woman he needed to impress, stopped believing him before the night began. He certainly did not know I had already pulled her and her career-defining signature out of his orbit. I did not argue or cry. I simply let him take the stage alone and watched his empire collapse right on time. My name is Violet Bell. I am 37 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have shared my life, my home, and my quietest hours with Dr. Nolan Pierce. Nolan is not just a surgeon. In the polished, ruthlessly competitive corridors of the Arbor Vale Surgical Institute here in Boston, he is an institution unto himself. He operates with a surgical precision that borders on the divine, or at least, that is what the glossy brochures and the wealthy benefactors like to say. Over the years, I have become intimately accustomed to the unique collateral damage that comes from loving a man who plays God on a daily basis. He has a habit of making me small, of whittling away at my edges with sharp, practiced remarks, and then smoothly categorizing the psychological amputation as simply maintaining an image. The gala was scheduled for a Friday. It was the premier annual event for the medical foundation affiliated with the Institute, a night of crystal chandeliers, high-stakes philanthropy, and strategic whispering. 2 days before the event, the morning sun was spilling across the mahogany floor of our bedroom, catching the dust motes dancing in the cold Boston air. Nolan stood before the full-length mirror, meticulously adjusting a pair of sapphire cufflinks. He had a way of looking at himself that was almost reverent, as if confirming his own undeniable importance to the world. I was sitting on the edge of the meticulously made bed, already dressed for the day, silently running through the mental checklist of seating arrangements and dietary restrictions for the Institute's board members. "I have been thinking about Friday," Nolan said. His voice was casual, almost an afterthought. He did not turn to look at me. His gaze remained locked on his own reflection, assessing the break of his tailored trousers, the crisp collar of his bespoke shirt. "Yes," I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "I think it would be better if you stayed home this year," he said, sliding the left cufflink into place with a definitive click. "The board is going to be incredibly demanding, and the press presence will be heavier than usual. It is going to be a highly stressful environment." He paused, taking a slow, measured breath before delivering the final, surgical strike. He softened his voice, coating the words in a thick layer of faux concern, as if he were shielding me from a terrible burden. "Frankly, Violet, you are too embarrassing to bring." The words hung in the quiet room. He delivered them so gently, with such a devastatingly calm cadence, that a less observant woman might have mistaken them for care. But I saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the hard, glittering disdain in his eyes as he finally glanced at my reflection in the mirror. He was not protecting me. He was erasing me. A sudden, sharp silence pressed against my eardrums. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, but my face remained an impassive mask. Years of rigorous training in the art of being a renowned surgeon's wife had taught me exactly how to bleed without leaving a stain on the carpet. I did not gasp. I did not throw the heavy silver hairbrush resting on the nightstand. I did not demand to know what he meant, or how he could say such a thing after everything I had built for him behind the scenes. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a perfectly calibrated smile, the exact kind I used when a major donor made an inappropriate joke at a crowded dinner party. "If that is what you think is best, Nolan, then I agree," I said. My voice was as smooth and unruffled as the silk sheets beneath me. "I will let the organizers know I am indisposed." The relief washed over him so visibly it was almost comical. The tension left his broad shoulders, and his rigid posture relaxed. He turned to me, offering a brief, condescending nod of approval. He truly believed I had swallowed the humiliation whole, digesting it without a single complaint, just as I had always done. He believed his own flawless narrative that I was a passive fading accessory, grateful just to be allowed to exist in his orbit. "Thank you for understanding, Violet. It really is for the best," he murmured. before picking up his leather briefcase and walking out the door. The heavy mahogany clicked shut behind him, leaving me in the echoing quiet of our perfect, suffocating bedroom. To the outside world, I was the undisputed master of the surgical social sphere. I was the gentle, sophisticated wife who knew precisely which vintage of Bordeaux to pour for the chief of cardiology. I knew that the pharmaceutical magnate from New York liked to be flattered about his amateur golf swing, and that the widow of the hospital's founder needed to hear heartfelt stories about her late husband's philanthropic legacy. I was the invisible architect of Nolan's charm, the social lubricant that kept his ascendant career moving without a hint of friction. But inside the silent theater of my own mind, I was keeping a very different sort of inventory. 13. That was the number. I remembered it with absolute, crystalline clarity. This was the 13th time Nolan had used the word embarrassing to describe me. I had started counting exactly 7 months ago, on a Tuesday evening after a dinner party where I had supposedly laughed too loudly at a joke made by a rival physician. Since then, the word had become his favorite weapon, deployed with increasing frequency and decreasing subtlety. I stood up from the bed, my movements deliberate and measured. I walked over to the antique vanity tucked into the alcove of my dressing room. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, all curved wood and brass fittings, a gift from Nolan's mother when we first bought the house. I reached beneath the center panel, pressing my fingers against a hidden latch I had installed myself. The secret drawer slid open with a soft, satisfying glide. Inside, nestled among old velvet jewelry boxes, I no longer opened, lay a charcoal leather notebook. It was unassuming, the kind of book one might use to jot down grocery lists or fleeting thoughts. But its pages held a far more meticulous accounting. I took the notebook out, feeling the textured leather against my fingertips. I uncapped a fine-tipped black pen and opened the book to the first empty page. The paper was thick and creamy, absorbing the ink instantly. I began to write. I recorded the date and the exact time, 8:45 in the morning. I wrote down the setting, the master bedroom, the cold morning light, him adjusting his sapphire cufflinks, and then I transcribed the exact words. Frankly, Violet, you are too embarrassing to bring. I documented the tonal shift, the feigned gentleness masking the deep-seated contempt. I noted the physical details, the way he refused to look directly at me when he delivered the sentence, choosing instead to address my reflection in the mirror, as if I were already a ghost haunting his periphery. I wrote with a steady hand, forming each letter with cold, analytical precision. I did not know exactly what I was building within these pages. I did not have a grand, sweeping master plan mapped out in my head yet, but I knew one fundamental truth with absolute certainty. Words like that, repeated with such calculated cruelty, were never just minor transgressions. They were not careless slips of the tongue born of stress. They were the visible fractures in the foundation of our life together. They were the undeniable signs of a structure that was slowly, inevitably failing. And when a massive structure begins to crack, a wise architect starts documenting the damage before the roof caves in entirely. I finished writing, blew gently on the wet ink to dry it, and closed the charcoal notebook. I placed it back into the secret drawer, pushing the wooden panel until it clicked securely into place, locking away the tangible evidence of my silent awakening. I turned away from the vanity and walked deeper into the expansive dressing room. The space was a testament to Nolan's overwhelming success, lined with custom cabinetry and filled with garments that spoke of immense wealth and high status. My eyes drifted toward the far end of the room, to a garment bag hanging in isolation against the cedar wall. I reached out and slowly unzipped the bag. Inside hung the dress I had chosen for the upcoming gala. It was a stunning creation of deep emerald silk, elegantly tailored, designed to catch the ambient light without ever demanding too much attention. It was the dress of a woman who knew her exact place, standing one step behind a great man. I reached out, my fingers lightly brushing the cool, smooth fabric of the bodice. It felt like touching a relic from a bygone era. For a long, silent moment, I just stood there, entirely alone in the quiet room, holding the material of a life I was no longer sure I inhabited. I looked at the emerald silk and realized I was not just mourning a missed party. I carefully zipped the garment bag back up, sealing the beautiful dress in complete darkness. I pushed it to the very back of the deep closet, wedging it firmly behind heavy winter coats and forgotten, out-of-season garments. I put it away quietly, definitively, exactly the way one might pack away an outdated, obsolete version of oneself. The woman who was willing to be erased was gone, packed away in the dark. The woman who remained had finally started keeping score. Growing up surrounded by the rolling green hills of Lexington, Kentucky, I learned early on that a good story is never about the loudest voice in the room. It is about the quiet details everyone else overlooks. My voice still carried the soft, warm cadence of the South, a trait that used to disarm rigid executives, making them open up and reveal truths they intended to keep hidden. Before I was Dr. Nolan Pierce's perfectly tailored wife, I was a highly sought-after producer of medical content and a brand storyteller. I possessed a distinct, undeniable instinct for peering right through the glossy, manufactured exterior of corporate healthcare and finding the genuine, often messy human pulse beating beneath it. I built my agency, Belframe Studio, by crafting narratives that resonated precisely because they cut through the superficiality. When Nolan and I first married, my small agency was just beginning to land major regional contracts. I was vibrant, constantly on the phone, sketching out campaign structures on napkins during our dinner dates. Nolan, meanwhile, was a rising surgical star at Arbor Vale, fiercely ambitious and entirely consumed by the cutthroat politics of the surgical wing. He recognized my momentum, and he knew exactly how to halt it with love. One evening, across a table at a quiet, dimly lit Italian restaurant, he reached out and covered my hand with his. His eyes were wide, earnest, and completely convincing. "Your work is wonderful, Violet, and you are incredibly talented," he had said, his voice a masterclass in reasonable persuasion. "But your field is flexible. You can restart it or pick up new clients at any time." My career, however, is at a critical juncture right now. The partnerships are being decided. I am in a phase where I simply cannot afford a single distraction. I need a partner who can be fully present to help me navigate this ascent. He made it sound like a grand, unified strategy. We were building an empire together, and for now, his foundation required all of our available resources. So, I yielded. I did not do it all at once. It was a slow, meticulously negotiated surrender. I started by declining the out-of-state freelance contracts that required heavy travel. 6 months later, I politely let go of my local retainers, citing personal commitments. Eventually, I packed up the exposed brick office of my beloved studio, brought my laptop home, and permanently closed the doors. My formidable skills in narrative strategy and public relations were quietly and entirely reallocated to the machinery of his success. I became the unseen, uncredited ghostwriter of his public persona. I orchestrated the elaborate fundraising dinners, deciding which patient anecdotes would best pry open the checkbooks of specific philanthropists. I drafted the highly personalized, seemingly effortless thank you notes that cemented his reputation as a brilliant doctor who truly cared about his community. The public absolutely revered him. The local press frequently lauded him as the rare, brilliant surgeon who also possessed the capacity to touch the public's heart. They marveled at the deep, resonant empathy he displayed during his keynote addresses at medical conventions and foundation galas. What those applauding audiences, wiping tears from their eyes, never knew was that those soaring, compassionate speeches were forged by me. I was the one awake until 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting at the cold granite kitchen island in my robe, rubbing my tired eyes while the blue light of the screen illuminated the dark room. I was the one interviewing the floor nurses to get the real stories, synthesizing the pain and the triumph into words that would move mountains of money. He simply took my understanding of human fragility, my meticulously crafted emotional arcs, and delivered them from behind a podium, accepting the standing ovations as his own absolute birthright. Instead of acknowledging the massive unseen labor that propped up his glittering image, Nolan began to actively resent any glimmer of my original self. As his star rose ever higher, his tolerance for my individuality shrank to zero. He started to edit me, exactly the way I used to edit rough drafts of advertising copy. He would place a heavy hand on the small of my back at a cocktail reception and whisper, with a tight smile, that my laugh was carrying a bit too far across the room. If I was engaged in an animated conversation with one of his colleagues, he would smoothly slide in, interrupt my story mid-sentence, and steer the dialogue back to sterile, clinical achievements that highlighted his own brilliance. Your anecdotes are charming, Violet, but perhaps a bit too detailed for this crowd, he would suggest on the quiet drive home, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. Try to be a bit less prominent. Let the medical work be the focus. We do not need to entertain them like a circus act. I was entirely enveloped in an ecosystem meticulously designed to shrink me down to a manageable, decorative size. His mother, a formidable woman of the old guard who firmly believed a wife's highest calling was silent facilitation, constantly praised my new, quiet elegance. The wives of the other senior medical partners, women who had long ago traded their own sharp minds for country club memberships and prominent last names, nodded in deep approval at my fading footprint. The more obedient and ornamental I became, the more worthy they deemed me to be a part of their elite circle. I was celebrated for my rigorous restraint. I was heavily rewarded for my total nothingness. The true terrifying nature of my erasure became undeniably clear on a crisp October night, right after the autumn donor gala. We were attending a private after-party in the penthouse of a luxury hotel overlooking the city. I had spent the better part of an hour making polite, engaging conversation with a major pharmaceutical heir, a man whose family trust was a primary target for Nolan's latest, highly ambitious expansion project. During a lull in the discussion about tax-deductible contributions, I had simply asked him a logical question. I inquired why the Institute was launching such an aggressive new funding campaign for the General Research Ward, while simultaneously boasting to the press about having just spent $40 million to expand the ultra-exclusive VIP recovery wing. It was a producer's question. It was born of a natural, professional curiosity about narrative consistency and the realistic allocation of vast financial resources. The heir had stammered, his wineglass hovering awkwardly in the air, his face flushing red as he suddenly looked very uncomfortable and cornered. Nolan had materialized instantly from across the room, his smile blindingly bright, smoothly changing the subject to a recent charity golf tournament before physically guiding me away by gripping my elbow hard enough to leave a bruise. His reaction in the car ride home was glacial and terrifying. "You completely humiliated me tonight," he hissed. The passing streetlights flashed across his face, illuminating the raw, unmasked anger contorting his handsome features. "You do not interrogate the donors about capital expenditures. You do not ask questions about where the money goes. You smile. You thank them for their time, and you move on. Is that so difficult for you to understand?" I stared out the window at the passing city blocks, the heavy silence in the car ringing in my ears. The realization hit me then with the devastating force of a physical blow. Nolan was not afraid that I was clumsy. He was not worried that I was socially inept or lacking in high society etiquette. He was absolutely terrified because I was observant. He feared my innate ability to look directly at a highly polished, expensive narrative and immediately spot the glaring structural flaws hidden beneath the surface. He was afraid that, despite his best efforts to suppress it, I still possessed the capacity to ask the exact right question in the exact wrong room. He did not want a partner with a mind. He wanted a shield that knew how to stay quiet and look pretty. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the passenger window, watching the blur of Boston slip away into the dark night. It is a profoundly bitter and terrifying thing to suddenly realize you are actively participating in your own vanishing. I did not disappear in a single dramatic explosion of conflict. There was no screaming match, no sudden packing of bags in the middle of the night. I disappeared beautifully. I faded out politely, wrapped in designer silk, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, and speaking in hushed, perfectly agreeable tones. My disappearance was seamless, It was profoundly elegant, and it was incredibly useful to everyone but myself. It was the second week of March, a Tuesday afternoon when the house was draped in that suffocating suburban quiet. I was sitting at the massive oak desk in Nolan's home office, tasked with our annual ritual organizing the preliminary paperwork for our joint tax return before handing it over to our accountant. The physical act of sorting through receipts, W-2 forms, and investment summaries was usually a mindless chore. I had my reading glasses on, methodically separating medical foundation reimbursements from personal expenses. Then, my fingers brushed against a thick, heavy stock paper buried near the bottom of a leather folder. It was an invoice, but it was not from a caterer or a surgical supplier. Staring back at me, printed in the clean, sans serif font I had personally chosen nearly a decade ago, was the name of my dormant company, Belframe Studio Limited Liability Company. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over the back of my neck. I had filed the final dissolution paperwork for Belframe exactly 4 years and 2 months ago, yet the date on this invoice was from October of the previous year. I scanned the itemized list of services. The descriptions were masterful in their corporate vagueness. Narrative advisory, donor perception strategy, executive communications support. The total amount due at the bottom was staggering $42,500. I knew with absolute, chilling certainty that I had never drafted this document. I had never rendered these services. And I had certainly never seen a check for $42,500 deposit into any of my personal accounts. I sifted frantically through the remaining stack, my pulse quickening. There were 3 more invoices, all boasting similar, nebulous descriptions, totaling over $120,000 billed within a single fiscal year. My gaze shifted to Nolan's iPad, which he had carelessly left charging on the corner of the desk. The screen was dark, but I knew his passcode. It was the year of his first major solo surgery. I tapped the numbers in, my hands remarkably steady, and opened his calendar app, cross-referencing the billing dates on the forged invoices. Mixed between his clinical rotations and board meetings were discrete, color-coded entries. They did not look like standard hospital appointments. They were cryptic, abrupt phrases. Eve, signature. Eve dinner. Eve lock before quarter close. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the iPad resting on my lap. Eve. The name hung in the quiet room. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the conditioning of a traditional wife kicked in, and I wondered if Eve was a mistress. I waited for the familiar, agonizing burn of romantic betrayal, the sting of a broken heart. But the pain never arrived. Instead, what bloomed in my chest was a profound, icy detachment. The thought of Nolan sleeping with another woman felt trivial, almost quaint, compared to the paperwork spread across the desk. Infidelity was a common, predictable cliché. This, however, was something entirely different. This was a calculated structural fraud. I picked up the last document in the folder. It was a vendor confirmation agreement. Seemingly acknowledging the completion of the narrative advisory work, I scrolled to the bottom of the page. There, resting neatly on the signature line, was my name. It was not a wet ink signature, but an electronic authentication stamp tied to my old administrative account. Someone was actively resurrecting my dead legal entity to move significant sums of money, and they were doing it under the guise of my digital authorization. If this blew up, if an auditor started digging, the paper trail would lead directly to my doorstep. I would not just be the humiliated wife. I would be the primary suspect in a financial embezzlement scheme. Panic is a useless emotion, so I banished it. I grabbed my phone and began photographing every single page. I captured the invoices, the dates, the amounts, and the forged electronic signatures. I made sure the lighting was clear and every letter was legible. Then, I turned my attention to my laptop. It took me 20 minutes to bypass the dormant security protocols and recover the administrative password for the old Belframe Studio email hosting service. When the inbox finally loaded, my breath hitched. There were dozens of automated system emails. I immediately navigated to the routing settings. Hidden deep within the forwarding rules was a directive I had never created. Every single email containing the words invoice, payment, signature, or Arbor Vale was being automatically and silently forwarded to a generic, encrypted secondary email address. I had been completely locked out of a room built under my own name. I closed the browser, cleared the cache, and meticulously returned the tax documents to their exact original positions inside the leather folder. I plugged the iPad back into its charger, making sure the angle of the screen matched how Nolan had left it. 4 hours later, the front door opened, and Nolan's heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. He walked into the kitchen, loosening his silk tie, projecting the aura of a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and carried it magnificently. I was standing by the stove, stirring a pot of risotto, the absolute picture of domestic tranquility. He poured himself a glass of red wine and leaned against the granite counter. He did not ask how my day was. Instead, he launched into a highly technical, thoroughly sanitized recounting of a 6-hour vascular bypass he had performed that afternoon. It was incredibly complex, Nolan said, taking a slow sip of his wine. The margin for error was less than 2 millimeters, but, of course, I managed to stabilize the graft perfectly. The residents were taking notes furiously. You really have to possess a certain psychological fortitude to hold someone's life in your hands and not let your hands shake. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had seamlessly stolen my name, resurrected my company, and forged my digital signature to launder God knows what kind of money, all while coming home to drink my wine and boast about his steady hands. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was breathtaking. He felt so completely untouchable, so deeply insulated by his own grandeur, that he did not even consider the possibility that his invisible wife might be looking at the ledgers. "That is wonderful, Nolan," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You always do have incredibly steady hands." He smiled, entirely missing the metallic edge in my tone, and took his wine into the living room. The moment he was out of earshot, I dried my hands on a towel, walked into the pantry, and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. Mara Keene had been my roommate during our sophomore year at university. She was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely devoid of sentimentality. She was now a senior partner at a boutique law firm in Providence, specializing specifically in white-collar financial crimes and corporate asset recovery. The phone rang twice before she answered. "Violet," Mara said. Her voice was sharp, professional, cutting straight through the static. "It has been a very long time. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I did not offer small talk. I did not ask about her life or pretend this was a friendly catch-up. I leaned against the cool wire shelving of the pantry, surrounded by jars of imported olives and organic broths, and delivered the only sentence that mattered. "Mara, I think someone is using my name to hide something, and I think it involves a lot of money." The line went dead silent. I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of a keyboard in the background as Mara's legal brain instantly shifted gears. She did not gasp. She did not offer me hollow sympathies or tell me to pack my bags and run. "Do you have physical access to the documentation?" she asked, her tone entirely stripped of emotion. "I have photographs of invoices, vendor agreements, and digital forwarding rules, totaling over $100,000 just this past year, billed through my old limited liability company. Who is the client on the invoices?" "The medical foundation affiliated with Nolan's hospital." Another pause. The clicking stopped. "Violet," Mara said slowly, her voice dropping an octave, "do not say a word to him. Do not change your routine. Do not ask questions. Can you maintain your current environment and keep perfectly calm for another 3 to 4 weeks while I assemble a team?" I looked at the closed pantry door, listening to the faint sound of the television playing in the living room where my husband sat, entirely confident in his constructed reality. I thought about the forged signatures sleeping quietly in his leather folder. "Mara," I replied, my voice a quiet, dangerous whisper in the dark room. "Calm is the only thing I have been practicing for the last 7 years." Mara did not waste a single moment. less than 48 hours after our brief, chilling phone call. She arranged for me to meet Elliot Voss. Elliot was a forensic accountant, a man whose entire professional existence revolved around finding the hidden truths buried beneath mountains of corporate deception. He was a stark contrast to the polished, charismatic surgeons and smooth-talking administrators in Nolan's elite circle. When I first walked into the sterile, windowless conference room we had rented by the hour in a nondescript co-working space downtown, Elliot barely looked up. He was wearing a slightly faded navy sweater, his posture hunched over a glowing laptop, projecting the aura of a man who found human interaction far less reliable than a balanced ledger. His reputation, Mara had assured me during the drive over, was legendary when it came to tracking obscured capital flowing through labyrinthine shell companies and complex philanthropic foundation funds. During our second clandestine meeting in that same depressing room, Elliot finally turned his screen toward me. The display was dominated by an intricate, color-coded flowchart that looked like a terrifying map of a foreign territory. He picked up a plain wooden pencil and tapped the eraser against a specific red box at the top of the screen, clearly labeled with the name of the Arbor Vale Medical Foundation. "The money originates right here," Elliot explained, his voice a low, gravelly monotone that somehow made the information even more menacing. "These specific grants are explicitly earmarked for public outreach, community health awareness, and high-level media campaigns. From the foundation account, the funds are dispersed directly into a newly opened commercial checking account associated with your supposedly defunct entity, Belframe Studio." He slowly traced a dark line across the screen, connecting my company's name to another box situated further down the chart. However, the capital absolutely does not stay there. My analysis shows that within 24 to 48 hours of every single deposit, exactly 85% of those funds are immediately wired out again. The destination is a boutique image management and public relations firm incorporated in Delaware. I leaned closer across the cheap laminate table, squinting at the name of the secondary firm. The breath caught in my throat. It was a company I instantly recognized. I had seen their name casually mentioned on several of Nolan's internal email chains regarding his upcoming national press tours and his push for a highly coveted board seat. It was an agency intimately tied to manufacturing and protecting his personal brand. The cold and heavy stone sitting in my stomach dropped another terrifying inch. If this intricate arrangement ever saw the light of day, if a curious state auditor or an ambitious investigative journalist decided to pull the thread on the hospital's charitable foundation, the paper trail was devastatingly clear. On official, legally binding documents, I was not the tragic victim of spousal identity theft. Legally speaking, I looked exactly like a willing, active accomplice. Worse, I looked like the primary beneficiary funneling stolen charity funds straight into my husband's private reputation machine. Nolan was meticulously setting me up to be the perfect, unwitting firewall. If the corrupt structure ever caught fire, I would be the one reduced to ash while he walked away completely untouched. "There is more, Violet," Elliot said quietly, pulling up a different spreadsheet tab. "I have been analyzing his submitted corporate expense reports over the past 24 months. I have found 9 distinct reimbursements for luxury travel and high-end accommodations. These trips are logged internally under the Foundation's donor cultivation and retention budget. He travels for medical conferences constantly," I countered instinctively, my brain desperately trying to process the sheer volume of betrayal. "He is always speaking at symposiums." "These specific dates were not conferences," Elliot corrected, his tone gentle but firm. "I cross-referenced these dates with the hospital's internal system. These dates correspond to weekends where his official surgical schedule, his clinical rotations, and his teaching roster were completely cleared. We are looking at flights to Miami, Aspen, and St. Bart's. The reimbursements average around $14,000 per trip. And once again, the justifying paperwork attached to these expenses explicitly references strategic media consultations with Belframe Studio." Mara, who had been standing silently by the closed door holding a paper cup of black coffee, finally stepped forward. She placed a firm, grounding hand on the back of my chair. Violet, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now, Mara said, her voice stripped of any collegiate warmth, replacing it with the sharp edge of a seasoned prosecutor. We have officially crossed a massive line. This is no longer a conversation about an emotionally abusive husband. This is no longer about whether he is having a midlife crisis or an affair on those long weekends in Aspen. We are looking at severe, undeniable legal liability. We are looking at systemic financial fraud, embezzlement, and the deliberate, calculated transfer of criminal risk onto your shoulders. If the hospital board or the federal authorities find out about this before we control the narrative, you could be facing prison time. The sheer, crushing gravity of her words stripped away the last lingering remnants of the woman I used to be. The obedient, silent wife died right there in that rented hourly workspace, replaced entirely by a woman who realized she was fighting a war for her own survival. When I returned to our immaculate, perfectly decorated house that afternoon, I looked at the pristine walls and the expensive contemporary art not as a sanctuary, but as an active crime scene waiting to be processed. I walked directly into the home study, locked the heavy oak door behind me, and began systematically opening every mental and digital vault I had previously forced myself to keep tightly shut. I dug into the deepest forgotten archives of our shared home network. I found old drafts of speeches I had written years ago, meticulously cross-referencing their original creation dates with the Foundation's historical event calendar. I unearthed archived email chains, complex donor party schedules, and exhaustive, highly vetted guest lists. I found copies of the heartfelt, sycophantic thank you notes I had composed in the dead of night, which Nolan had subsequently signed and mailed to wealthy benefactors under his own prestigious letterhead. It took me 4 solid days of covert, exhausting digging while Nolan was performing surgeries at the clinic, but a terrifying, undeniable pattern finally emerged from the data. Every single time a massive sum of foundation money needed to be justified under the vague, unassailable umbrella of donor experience or executive communications, the name of my old company was dragged out of its grave to act as a convenient, unquestionable screen. He was taking the very talent he had forced me to abandon and weaponizing its corpse to secretly fund his relentless ascension to power. From that moment onward, my life irrevocably split into 2 distinct parallel tracks. Track 1 was the charcoal leather notebook securely hidden in the false bottom of my vanity drawer. That was my emotional ledger. There, I continued to meticulously document every patronizing remark, every deliberate public slight, and every single time he used his soft, chillingly calm voice to remind me of my supposed insignificance. It was a repository for the ongoing psychological warfare in our marriage. Track 2 was the heavily encrypted legal directory I built on a secure offshore cloud server Elliot had configured for me. This was the war room. In this digital folder, there was no room for feelings, only cold, hard facts. It contained high-resolution scans of every forged financial document, exact dates of fake signatures, precise digital timestamps of unauthorized server logins, and the names of the board members who had blindly approved the fraudulent disbursements. That evening, Nolan returned home exhausted, complaining bitterly about the sheer incompetence of his assisting scrub nurses during a routine procedure. I poured him a glass of expensive scotch, exactly the way he liked it, 2 fingers neat. I listened to his arrogant rant, my face a flawless, practiced mask of sympathetic domesticity. But behind my eyes, the fundamental architecture of my reality had permanently shifted. I sat across from him in the dimly lit living room, watching him sip his liquor, completely oblivious to the trap closing around him. The agonizing internal monologue that had plagued me for years was finally silent. For the longest time, I had tortured myself with a single desperate question. I would lie awake at night, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering, am I overreacting to his cruelty? Looking at the man who had casually mortgaged my legal freedom to buy his own legacy, that question dissolved into absolute nothingness. I was not overreacting. I had simply been blind to the true nature of the predator in my house. As he continued to detail his surgical triumphs to the empty room, I took a slow sip of my own drink, feeling a new, far more dangerous question taking deep root in my mind. How much more have I not seen I had known Evelyn Street? Claire for several months before the fractured pieces of my reality finally aligned to reveal her true significance. Everyone in our rarefied social circle simply called her Eve. We initially crossed paths while serving on the advisory board for the historical preservation of a crumbling, Gilded Age theater in the heart of downtown Boston. Eve was a woman of indeterminate older age, possessing a rigid, immaculate posture that demanded immediate deference. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of bespoke garments in muted tones, projecting an aura of quiet, generational wealth that made the flashy, newly rich wives of the Surgical Institute look like amateurs. From the very beginning, Eve had favored me over the other women on the committee. Her preference was not born of warmth, but of a shared, unspoken intolerance for the absurd. I flatly refused to engage in the sycophantic, hollow vocabulary so typical of the philanthropic circuit. During a particularly exhausting board meeting discussing a proposed $1 million fundraising drive, the marketing director had presented a glossy, highly produced video concept. When asked for my opinion, I did not offer the expected praise. I looked at the storyboards and stated plainly that the campaign was far too polished to look authentic, lacking the necessary human grit to make wealthy donors actually feel something real. From across the expansive mahogany table, Eve had caught my eye. She did not smile, but she offered a microscopic, definitive nod of approval. It was only after Elliot dove deeper into the labyrinth of the hospital's financial architecture that the terrifying truth about my elegant acquaintance came to light. Evelyn Street. Claire was not merely an art enthusiast with deep pockets and a surplus of free time. She was the widow of the original founder of the entire medical trust that financed the Arbor Vale ecosystem. More importantly, she was the primary trustee holding the ultimate deciding vote in the massive, highly controversial commercial expansion that Nolan was currently salivating over. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. The cryptic, urgent entries on Nolan's digital calendar were suddenly stripped of their mystery. Eve-Dash signature. It was never a secret hotel rendezvous or a clumsy midlife affair. It was a calculated corporate siege. Nolan was aggressively maneuvering to force Eve into signing a massive restructuring package before the end of the fiscal quarter. That single signature would unilaterally dissolve the old oversight committees, pushing Nolan into a position of near absolute executive power and granting him unchecked access to tens of millions of dollars in development capital. Au fond, he was not trying to sleep with her. He was trying to conquer her late husband's empire. For 3 agonizing days, I engaged in a brutal silent war within my own mind. To approach Eve with the truth was to permanently burn the ships. Once I opened my mouth and presented the physical evidence of my husband's systemic fraud, the passive, quiet wife would be officially dead. There would be no slipping back into the comfort of my gilded cage, no acting as though I had merely misread some complicated tax paperwork. I would be setting in motion the unraveling of the life I had known. But the alternative, allowing Nolan to use my stolen identity to cannibalize a charitable foundation while I smiled and adjusted his neckties, was a poison I could no longer swallow. On a remarkably dreary Tuesday afternoon, while Nolan was scrubbed in for a complex spinal fusion, I requested a private audience at Eve's residence in Beacon Hill. Her townhouse was a fortress of heavy stone, smelling faintly of old paper, expensive black tea, and polished mahogany. A silent housekeeper led me into a private drawing room overlooking a meticulously manicured courtyard. Eve was seated in a high-backed leather wing chair, a delicate porcelain teacup resting in her hands. She did not offer me meaningless pleasantries or ask about Nolan's surgical schedule. She merely gestured to the empty chair across from her, her sharp, intelligent eyes tracking my every movement. I sat down, keeping my spine perfectly straight, and placed a thick, unassuming manila folder onto the low glass table between us. Inside that folder was the curated nightmare Elliot and Mara had helped me assemble. It contained the fraudulent invoices, the routed email logs, the wire transfer receipts, the forged electronic signatures bearing my name, and the definitive proof that her late husband's charitable legacy was being systematically drained to fund a shadow public relations campaign designed to secure her very own signature. "I need you to look at these," I said, my voice remarkably steady, devoid of any theatrical emotion. "And I need you to understand that I did not authorize a single page." Eve did not gasp. She did not clutch her chest or express the dramatic outrage one might expect from a woman discovering a massive betrayal of her family's trust. She simply set her teacup down with a soft clink, picked up a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses from the side table, and slid them onto her nose. She opened the folder. For nearly an hour, the only sounds in the elegant drawing room were the steady, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the crisp rustle of paper being turned. I sat perfectly still, watching her eyes scan the ledgers, tracking the flow of stolen capital. I watched her read the emails where Nolan brutally commanded his subordinates to expedite the image manipulation strategies using my defunct company as the shield. When she finally spoke, her voice was glacial. She did not offer sympathy. She initiated an interrogation. Her questions were terrifyingly precise, cutting straight past the emotional betrayal to target the structural integrity of the fraud. She asked about the specific routing numbers, forcing me to explain Elliot's findings regarding the Delaware shell companies. She made me recite the exact timeline of the forged signatures, and then, 10 minutes later, she abruptly asked me to repeat it a second time. Testing my memory for any sign of hesitation or inconsistency, I answered every question with cold, factual clarity, stripping away my role as a wife and leaning entirely into my past life as a professional who understood corporate narratives. After 55 minutes, Eve closed the manila folder. She removed her glasses, folded them deliberately, and looked out the window at the gray Boston sky. The silence stretched between us, heavy and pregnant with impending ruin. Men's talents often make them believe that everything else belongs to them, too. Eve finally said. Her voice was a quiet, devastating murmur that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by several degrees, including trust. She turned her gaze back to me, and in her eyes, I saw the exact same cold, calculated detachment that had been growing inside my own chest for weeks. We were two women separated by decades, yet entirely united by the profound exhaustion of watching a mediocre man mistake our silence for stupidity. We did not shake hands. We did not draft a contract. We formed a silent, unbreakable pact forged in the quiet understanding of how true power operates. Eve instructed me that there would be no immediate confrontation. To strike now would merely give Nolan the opportunity to scramble his legal team, destroy auxiliary evidence, and paint me as a hysterical, vengeful spouse suffering from a psychological break. Instead, we would grant him exactly what he craved most. We would give him the illusion of total control. Eve would continue to play the role of the hesitant, but slowly yielding board member, stringing him along, attending his private dinners, and making him believe his grand manipulation was working flawlessly. I would return to my sprawling, suffocating house and continue to play the role of the perfectly subdued, invisible wife. We would let Nolan walk freely onto the stage he had built for himself, allowing him to grow so undeniably confident, so completely arrogant, that he would inevitably lock the final chains of his own trap. I left the Beacon Hill townhouse and stepped out into the damp, chilling air, pulling my coat tight against the wind. As I walked down the cobblestone street, leaving the manila folder securely in Eve's possession, I felt lighter than I had in nearly a decade. The game had officially changed, and my husband was entirely unaware that he was no longer the one moving the pieces. As the foundation gala loomed closer, the atmosphere inside our sprawling house grew incredibly thin, suffocatingly tight, like the air inside a pressure cabin right before a catastrophic failure. Nolan's cruelty shifted from passive condescension to active, aggressive erasure. He no longer simply suggested I fade into the background. He forcefully removed me from the canvas altogether. 3 days before the event, I stood perfectly still in the hallway, listening to him on the phone with his executive assistant in his home study. His voice was brisk, surgical, entirely stripped of any marital warmth or basic human respect. "Have Violet completely removed from the main seating chart at table 1, he commanded, the leather of his desk chair creaking as he leaned back. "If any of the board members ask about her absence, just tell them she is not suited for this kind of high-stakes event. Tell them she gets overwhelmed by the press and prefers to stay home. We need the space for key stakeholders anyway." In my place, his professional shadow became Celeste Rowan, the director of communications for Arbor Vale. Celeste was a woman constructed entirely of sharp corporate angles, expensive keratin treatments, and profound moral flexibility. She knew exactly which organizational secrets to bury and precisely which wealthy donors to flatter. Over the past few weeks, she had become his constant, highly visible companion, a polished mirror perfectly angled to reflect his boundless ambition back at him. They spoke in hushed tones in the corners of hospital corridors, their conversations ceasing the moment I walked into a room. I offered zero resistance. I became a compliant ghost haunting the polished hardwood floors of my own marriage. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation for my sudden removal from the guest list, and I certainly did not shed a single tear. In fact, on the very afternoon of the gala, I stood quietly in his expansive dressing room, my hands perfectly steady as I helped him select a charcoal silk tie to complement his custom tuxedo. I even read over the final draft of his anticipated thank you speech, gently suggesting a minor rhetorical tweak to the opening paragraph to make him sound more magnanimous and humble. When I handed the speech back to him, he patted my hand, a gesture reeking of condescending victory. He was absolutely, fundamentally certain that he had finally broken my spirit, reducing me to a harmless, decorative domestic appliance that knew exactly when to power down. He was wrong. At 4 o'clock that same afternoon, while Nolan was getting his hair trimmed at an exclusive salon across town, I was standing in the damp, echoing service corridor of the luxury hotel hosting the gala. The air smelled sharply of industrial floor cleaner and the heavy, metallic scent of roasting prime rib wafting from the massive catering kitchens. I wore a simple black trench coat, my hair pulled back tightly, blending into the shadows of the loading dock. A sleek black town car idled near the service elevator. The tinted rear window rolled down smoothly, revealing Evelyn St. Clair sitting in the dim, leather-scented interior. I stepped forward and slipped a heavy, sealed envelope through the narrow gap. Inside was the final, devastating summary of the illicit cash flow, meticulously documented by Elliot. More importantly, it contained a single printed page, a newly recovered internal email sent at 2 a.m. just 5 days prior. In that email, Nolan explicitly threatened Arbor Vale's internal legal department, aggressively demanding they secure Eve's signature on the restructuring documents before the upcoming quarterly audit, explicitly citing the need to bypass standard compliance reviews. It was the smoking gun of his absolute desperation. Eve took the envelope. Her expression was carved from pale marble, her eyes scanning the top document for only a few seconds before she looked back up at me. We exchanged no pleasantries. The transaction required no words. The window rolled up with a quiet hum, and the heavy car glided away toward the VIP underground garage. The grand ballroom that evening was a masterpiece of opulent intimidation, dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with exotic floral arrangements. I was not seated among the 500 wealthy guests, but I was in the building, waiting patiently in a private, secure suite 3 floors above the main event, sipping sparkling water and watching the hours tick by. Down below, Nolan entered the hall looking exactly like a conquering emperor returning to Rome. He spent the entire cocktail hour holding court, a glass of expensive champagne balanced in his hand, his charismatic smile perfectly calibrated for the flashing cameras of the local society press. He firmly believed that tonight was his ultimate coronation. He believed with every fiber of his being that Eve would eventually take the stage, publicly endorse his massive new surgical wing expansion, and formally attach his name to a legacy project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He confidently took his seat at the center of the primary honor table, flanked by the highest-ranking hospital executives and a radiant Celeste Rowan. But as the lavish appetizer plates were cleared away by an army of waiters, a glaring, terrifying void became apparent. The prominent chair reserved for Evelyn Street, Claire, remained entirely empty. Nolan did not know that Eve had bypassed the glittering ballroom altogether. She had walked straight from the underground garage into a soundproof executive boardroom on the mezzanine level, where the Foundation's independent legal counsel and top financial auditors were already waiting for her under strict orders. She placed my compiled dossier onto the heavy oak table and quietly, but with absolute authority, demanded an immediate, indefinite hold on all public announcements regarding the structural expansion. Down in the brightly lit hall, the atmosphere began to undergo a subtle, agonizing shift. The master of ceremonies took the stage to begin the keynote addresses. Nolan adjusted his cuffs, his posture straightening instinctively in eager anticipation of his grand introduction. The speaker read enthusiastically through the prepared script, thanking the corporate sponsors, highlighting the year's medical achievements, and then, smoothly and without a single beat of hesitation, completely bypassed the entire restructuring announcement. There was no mention of the new surgical wing. There was no mention of Nolan's visionary leadership. The script had been surgically amputated, leaving only empty air where his monumental triumph was supposed to be. Nolan kept the bright smile plastered on his handsome face, but the rigid mask was visibly slipping. His eyes began to dart around the massive room, frantic, searching, and entirely unmoored. The confident, untouchable surgeon was suddenly a man realizing the floorboards were rotting out from beneath his expensive leather shoes. He leaned over and whispered sharply to Celeste, whose own perfectly contoured face rapidly drained of all color as she realized the catastrophic implication of the silence. The carefully orchestrated, fraudulent reality they had built together was unraveling in real time. Live in front of the most powerful people in the city. As the agonizingly long, tense dinner finally concluded, and the confused guests began to migrate toward the coat checks, Nolan desperately scoured the venue corridors for any sign of his missing benefactor. He paced near the exit of the grand foyer, his jaw tight, his carefully managed temper threatening to boil over into a public scene. Then he saw it. Down a secluded, heavily guarded hallway, meant exclusively for the highest tier of hotel management and Foundation executives, two figures were walking away from the clamor of the party. It was a fleeting, accidental glimpse, lasting no more than 3 or 4 seconds, before a pair of heavy brass doors swung shut, cutting off his line of sight, but it was more than enough. He saw the distinctive, rigid posture and the silver hair of Evelyn Street, Claire, and walking right beside her, keeping perfect, confident pace, not as an excluded, embarrassing wife unfit for high society, but as a deeply trusted woman granted full access to the most decisive room in the building, was me. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when the heavy front door of our house finally clicked open. I was already sitting in the darkened living room, a single reading lamp casting a small pool of warm light over my lap. I was not reading a book. I was simply waiting in the quiet dark. Nolan walked into the room. The arrogant, conquering stride was completely gone. He looked visibly aged, the skin around his eyes tight, pale, and profoundly exhausted. He stopped dead in the center of the expensive Persian rug and stared at me. The silence in the house was absolute, thick enough to choke on. For a long, suffocating minute, neither of us spoke a single word. Slowly, he reached up to his collar to untie his charcoal silk bow tie. As he pulled the dark fabric loose, I watched his hands. They were the legendary, heavily insured, flawlessly steady hands of Boston's finest surgeon, and in the dim, unforgiving light of our quiet home, I saw those perfect hands distinctly, undeniably tremble. He looked at my face, his dark eyes wide and hollow, no longer seeing the quiet, obedient woman he thought he had successfully erased from existence. For the very first time in our entire decade-long marriage, he was looking at a complete stranger, realizing far too late that the silent, accommodating ghost haunting his pristine house was the exact person holding all the matches to his empire. The morning sun hitting the kitchen island felt sharp, completely devoid of its usual suburban warmth. Nolan was already awake. He was seated at the granite counter, ignoring the expensive espresso machine humming softly in the corner. The meticulously crafted mask of the benevolent, untouchable surgeon had fractured overnight. His eyes were bloodshot, and his jaw was set in a rigid line that betrayed the frantic calculations happening behind it. "So," Nolan began, his voice dropping an octave, aiming for a tone of intimate, conspiratorial partnership that made my skin crawl. "We need to talk about last night. What exactly did you say to Eve Saint, Claire, in that hallway? You know we are a team. Violet, whatever misunderstanding is happening, we have to handle it as a family." I poured myself a glass of cold water, my movements deliberate and slow. I did not shrink. I did not avert my gaze. I looked directly into his desperate, exhausted eyes. I did what was absolutely necessary to protect my own name. I said. The silence that followed was violently loud. I did not add a softening clause. I did not apologize for upsetting him. I offered zero explanations to fill the void. I simply let the raw, unadorned sentence sit between us. Nolan physically recoiled, his hand gripping the edge of the granite counter so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. In the 10 years we had been married, he had never heard me speak a complete, definitive sentence without immediately following it with a submissive clarification. He was suddenly staring at a lock he did not have the key to open. His retaliation was swift, silent, and entirely predictable. Within 48 hours, the velvet ropes of my gilded cage were pulled tight. I stood at a local cafe on a Tuesday morning, attempting to pay for a black tea, only to have the cashier hand my platinum card back with an apologetic wince. It was declined. By noon, I opened my phone to check our shared schedule and found the calendar application wiped completely blank. My access had been unilaterally revoked. The most pointed threat arrived via a formal, sterile email sent from his internal legal department directly to my personal inbox. It was a thinly veiled directive stating that the hospital was initiating a comprehensive review of all security boundaries and external data access by non-essential family members. It was his way of letting me know he was actively building a wall, trying to lock me out of the very fortress he had constructed using my stolen identity. But the walls were already starting to rot from the inside. Arbor Vale released an exceptionally vague, carefully worded memorandum to its senior staff later that same afternoon. The hospital announced an immediate, indefinite procedural review of several key media and donor funding initiatives. It was corporate speak for a massive internal panic. The whispers within the medical community started immediately, spreading like a contagion through the private dining clubs and surgical lounges. That evening, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unregistered number. I answered it standing in the dim light of the living room. "Violet, hi, it is Celeste." Her voice was breathy, heavily coated in a thick layer of synthetic concern. "I know things are incredibly tense right now with the board, and I just wanted to check on you. You always have such a good read on these philanthropic situations. I was wondering what your perspective was on the current audit." She was not calling to apologize for parading around as my husband's new shadow. She was terrified. She was blindly casting a line into the dark, desperately trying to gauge exactly how much of the fraudulent iceberg I could see. Her poorly disguised fishing expedition confirmed the absolute worst. Celeste Rowan was not merely an ambitious subordinate following Nolan's orders. She was deeply, inextricably embedded in the financial manipulation. "I am afraid I cannot help you, Celeste," I replied, my voice perfectly flat. "You will have to rely on your own communication strategy." I hung up the phone before she could formulate another lie. The true depth of the danger, however, did not reveal itself until I met Elliot the following morning at our rented workspace. The forensic accountant looked paler than usual. He did not point to a spreadsheet this time. He pressed play on a video file. It was a highly emotional, beautifully produced patient testimony video featuring a young woman who had undergone a complex spinal procedure under Nolan's care. It was the exact video that had successfully secured a massive influx of charitable donations the previous year. "Watch the post-operative mobility data on the screen behind the patient," Elliot instructed, his voice grave. I watched. The graphics displayed a staggering, miraculous recovery rate. I managed to pull the original, unedited raw footage from an archived server. Elliot continued, opening a second window side by side. The actual medical outcomes were completely altered in post-production. The recovery times were drastically shortened, and the complication risks were artificially erased. He did not just inflate his budget. Violet, he falsified patient outcome narratives to defraud high-net-worth donors. My blood turned to ice. "And here is the kill shot," Elliot said, pointing to the digital metadata attached to the manipulated file. The final, edited video was exported and delivered to the hospital's marketing team from an encrypted cloud drive registered under the primary administrative account for Belframe Studio Limited Liability Company. The room started to spin. This was no longer just about financial embezzlement or a wounded ego. This was federal medical fraud. If the authorities traced that manipulated video back to its digital origin, Nolan would not just lose his medical license. He would go to federal prison. And because he had so meticulously woven my dormant company into the fabric of his crime, I was standing directly on the blast radius. He had turned my identity into a lethal legal bomb, ready to detonate the moment the auditors dug deep enough. I had to move. I knew exactly how Nolan's mind worked. The moment he felt truly cornered, he would pivot to his most reliable defense mechanism, character assassination. He would hire the best crisis management firm in Boston to paint me as an emotionally unstable, deeply paranoid spouse undergoing a severe psychological break. He would use my quiet demeanor against me, claiming I had retreated into delusions. He would file for an involuntary psychiatric hold if it meant discrediting my testimony. I did not give him the chance to draft that narrative. While he was scrubbed into a lengthy afternoon surgery, I packed. I did not take the designer gowns, the expensive jewelry, or any of the heavy, suffocating trappings of the life he had purchased for me. I packed 2 medium-sized suitcases with practical clothing, my secure laptop, my encrypted backup drives, and the charcoal leather notebook. By the time the sun began to set over the Charles River, I was standing inside a sterile, sparsely furnished short-term serviced apartment situated on the edge of Beacon Hill. It smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and fresh paint, a stark contrast to the rich mahogany and imported leather of the home I had just abandoned. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind me and walked over to the large window overlooking the bustling city streets below. A profound sense of clarity washed over me, sharp and absolute. The power dynamic had violently, irrevocably shifted. Nolan still resided in the massive suburban mansion. He still wore the prestigious white coat. He still possessed the high-limit credit cards, and he still commanded the respect of the surgical theater. He had the title, the money, and the fame. But as I set my leather notebook down on the cheap laminate dining table, I realized none of his accumulated wealth mattered anymore. He was a king locked inside a burning castle, completely unaware that the fire had already breached the inner walls. He had the entire world fooled, but I was the only one holding the undisputed, heavily documented pulse of the truth, and I was finally ready to let it beat. The counterattack began exactly 48 hours after I moved into the apartment. A process server knocked on my newly painted door and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. Nolan had filed an emergency injunction in Superior Court. The petition was a masterclass in aggressive fictionalization. He was legally demanding the immediate return of highly sensitive proprietary materials. His strategy was glaringly obvious and brutally dangerous. He was trying to preemptively frame me as a disgruntled, mentally unstable spouse who had illegally absconded with protected medical records and confidential patient data. If the judge bought his narrative, I would be facing immediate federal charges, and anything I possessed would be dismissed as the poisoned fruit of a massive theft. I immediately scanned the documents and sent them to Mara. She did not panic. In fact, when she called me 10 minutes later, she sounded almost bored by his absolute predictability. "He is getting sloppy," Mara said over the phone, the sound of her turning pages echoing in the background. "He wants to classify you as a rogue actor stealing patient data, but we are filing a motion to dismiss before the ink is even dry. You did not take a single medical chart. Violet, you took corporate governance files, tax documents, and original media assets that legally belong to Belframe Studio Limited Liability Company. You are the sole registered owner of that entity. A man cannot accuse his wife of stealing her own company's administrative paperwork." Mara crushed his emergency injunction within a single afternoon, but she did not stop there. While preparing our formal rebuttal, she brought in a specialized digital forensics team to scrutinize the electronic signatures bearing my name. The results were a lethal strike against his entire defense. The logs proved that my supposed electronic authorizations on the fraudulent media contracts were not executed from our home network or my personal devices. The digital stamps had been applied late at night, often past 11 o'clock, originating directly from a highly secured private Internet protocol address located within the Executive Administrative Suite of Arbor Vale. Mara cross-referenced the dates. On one specific Thursday evening when my signature magically approved a $50,000 transfer, I had been standing in my own dining room, hosting his mother for an agonizingly long dinner. To solidify the evidence, Elliot managed to quietly contact an outgoing network administrator at the hospital. The man was 2 weeks away from retirement and deeply resentful of the hospital's toxic upper management. In a completely off-the-record conversation at a loud downtown bar, the technician confirmed that Nolan's personal credentials had been quietly granted a severe system override. It was an executive privilege officially categorized as urgent document resolution, completely bypassing standard compliance protocols. Nolan had essentially demanded a digital skeleton key, and the hospital had handed it to him. While we were reinforcing our legal fortress, the opposing camp began to devour itself. Celeste Rowan, the polished communications director, who had been so eager to stand by Nolan's side, suddenly realized she was standing on a trap door. Nolan, realizing the financial audit was closing in, had begun laying the groundwork to shift the entire blame for the manipulated patient videos and the shady media spending directly onto the external vendor. That vendor, of course, was my old company, but Celeste was the internal point of contact for all public relations. She was the one who processed the invoices. If Nolan successfully blamed Belframe, Celeste would be the logical internal scapegoat for failing to properly vet the contractor. She panicked. But she did not come crying to me, and she did not offer to be a star witness for our side. Celeste was far too self-serving for redemption. Instead, a massive, unexpected twist rocked the board of directors. The external legal counsel representing the foundation received a massive data dump via an anonymous, encrypted email service. Mara's contacts within the firm confirmed the contents. It was a perfectly organized chain of internal communications, completely unredacted. The email showed Nolan explicitly bullying the communications department, forcefully demanding they manipulate the patient outcome statistics to secure the new structural expansion. I sat in Mara's Providence office when she told me about the leak. I realized instantly who had sent it. Celeste had no loyalty to Nolan, and she certainly had no loyalty to me. She was simply choosing the only side that guaranteed her professional survival. She was burning the ship to ensure she got a seat on the only lifeboat. It made the entire situation infinitely more dangerous, colder, and far less predictable. There were no heroes in that hospital, only mercenaries. Meanwhile, Eve Saint. Claire was not content to let the hospital executives sweep the impending scandal under a thick rug of non-disclosure agreements. Leveraging the massive weight of her late husband's legacy, she aggressively outmaneuvered the hospital president. She formally demanded a special, emergency session of the Foundation Board of Directors, refusing to allow the financial discrepancies to be handled in a closed-door settlement. She wanted everything dragged out into the harsh, unforgiving light of the boardroom. Nolan was finally backed into a corner, and like any cornered predator, he tried to buy his way out. 3 days before the scheduled emergency board meeting, his high-priced divorce attorney sent a couriered package to Mara's office. It was a comprehensive marital dissolution agreement. The terms were staggering. He was offering me an immediate cash settlement of $3,500,000, full ownership of a vacation property we owned in Maine, and guaranteed alimony for the next 10 years. There was, naturally, a massive condition attached to the golden parachute. The contract included a draconian, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. It required me to permanently hand over all evidence, publicly retract any statements regarding his financial conduct, and immediately leave the state of Massachusetts. He was offering me a fortune to simply evaporate and let him survive the audit by claiming it was all a bureaucratic misunderstanding. Mara slid the thick document across her heavy mahogany desk. I did not even pick up a pen. "Reject it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but vibrating with absolute certainty. "Violet, I need to formally advise you as your attorney," Mara stated, leaning back in her leather chair. "This is an extraordinary amount of capital. It secures your future entirely." "It is blood money," I replied, staring at the glossy cover page. "This is no longer about his money. Mara, it is about my name. If I sign that document, my name remains permanently attached to his fraudulent structure. I become the silent accomplice he always wanted me to be. Tell his lawyers the offer is declined." "We are going to the board." Mara looked at me for a long, silent moment. She reached out and pulled the settlement offer back across the desk, dropping it unceremoniously into her recycling bin. "All right," Mara said, her tone suddenly devoid of any professional detachment. It was the voice of a general preparing for the final siege. "You need to understand the gravity of this decision. Violet, we have officially crossed the threshold. We have passed the point where we can hit the brakes and negotiate a clean, quiet stop. We have cut the brake lines entirely. From this exact second onward, gravity takes over. When this hits the boardroom, someone is going to fall completely, and they are not going to get back up." "I know," I answered, feeling a cold, dark smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Make sure it is him." The emergency session was convened on a Thursday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. It was not held in the familiar, opulent surroundings of the Arbor Vale executive suites, but rather in the sterile, intimidating glass-walled conference room of an independent outside legal counsel located deep in the financial district. Eve Saint. Claire had orchestrated the entire venue change. She summoned the foundation board of directors, 3 independent financial advisors, and a team of ruthless external auditors. For the absolute first time in his glittering, unimpeded professional life, Dr. Nolan Pierce was not the man calling the shots. He was summoned. He was forced into a deeply passive, defensive posture, stripped entirely of his home court advantage. Despite the severe change in scenery, Nolan arrived projecting an aura of impenetrable confidence. I watched him enter from my seat next to Mara at the far end of the long mahogany table. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, flashing his trademark charismatic smile at the board members he had spent years grooming. I knew exactly what narrative he was clinging to. He genuinely believed his surgical prestige and his carefully cultivated public charm would effortlessly overpower the allegations. He was ready to paint me as a deeply bitter, vindictive spouse lashing out in the midst of a painful, high-conflict divorce. He thought this was a domestic dispute that had unfortunately spilled into the boardroom. He was profoundly mistaken. Only 30 minutes before the heavy glass doors swung shut, Elliot had transmitted the final, devastating piece of the financial puzzle to Mara's encrypted tablet. The forensic accountant had finally broken through the last layer of the Delaware shell companies. The final trace proved conclusively that the stolen foundation funds routed through my defunct company name were not just padding his personal travel budget. Elliot uncovered a massive, hidden expenditure of $250,000. This money was secretly wired to a third-party media conglomerate to pre-purchase the exclusive rights and control the entire narrative of the merger announcement, completely bypassing the required quarterly financial audit. He had stolen foundation money to buy the megaphone that would announce his own manufactured coronation. Mara had not come empty-handed either. While Elliot tracked the cash, she had successfully subpoenaed the final digital authentication logs from the hospital's internal servers. The evidence was irrefutable. The specific email containing the final approval signature from Belframe's studio had not just been sent from the hospital network. It had been transmitted exactly at 11:45 at night from a registered secondary mobile device belonging directly to Nolan. Furthermore, the building access logs placed both Nolan and Celeste Rowan inside the executive suite at that precise minute. As the meeting commenced, the chairman of the board attempted to open with a series of diplomatic, softening remarks. Eve did not allow him to finish. She sat at the absolute center of the table, her posture rigid, her expression carved from granite. She raised a single, elegantly manicured hand, bringing the entire room to a dead, suffocating halt. "We are not here to discuss procedural misunderstandings," Eve stated, her voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "I requested this emergency session because I have been subjected to highly aggressive, completely unethical pressure to fast-track my signature on the restructuring documents. Furthermore, I have been presented with undeniable evidence that the internal governance system of this foundation has been subjected to deliberate, systemic deception." Nolan shifted in his leather chair. The charismatic smile instantly vanished, replaced by a mask of grave, practiced concern. He leaned forward, attempting to deploy the exact psychological manipulation he had used on me for a decade. Please," Nolan said, his voice dropping into that familiar, soothing register. "I understand there is a great deal of confusion right now. We are dealing with a very sensitive, highly unfortunate personal situation regarding my marriage. Violet has been struggling significantly, and it deeply breaks my heart to see her project her emotional instability onto the foundation. I assure you, every financial decision made was entirely transparent and fully vetted by our communications team." Eve did not even blink. She did not look at him with sympathy or doubt. She looked at him with the cold, absolute disgust of a woman observing an insect on her pristine dining table. "Do not insult my intelligence, Doctor Pierce, by attempting to hide your financial fraud behind the skirts of your wife," Eve commanded, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Especially when the digital logs sitting in front of your own legal counsel clearly demonstrate that you forged her electronic signature from your personal device while your communications director stood in the room." The silence that violently slammed into the conference room was absolute. Several board members physically recoiled, their eyes darting frantically between the printed dossiers Mara had distributed and the pale, suddenly sweating face of their star surgeon. Then, Eve delivered the ultimate, fatal twist. It was a revelation so profound it shattered the very foundation of Nolan's entire reality. "You have been operating under a severely flawed assumption regarding the Arbor Vale expansion," Eve continued, adjusting her reading glasses. "You constructed this entire elaborate campaign, you falsified patient data, and you jeopardized your medical license under the belief that my late husband's trust would automatically release the $80 million required for the new surgical center upon my signature." Nolan stared at her, the color rapidly draining from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. "The primary funding for the new wing does not exist in the current foundation charter," Eve revealed, the words landing like heavy stones. "That capital was entirely dependent on a highly specific amendment to my personal will and estate plan, an amendment that, as of this morning, I have officially instructed my attorneys to shred unexecuted." The room started to spin for him. I could see the exact moment his towering, glittering empire collapsed into dust. The grand building destined to bear his name, the soaring keynote speeches he had spent weeks practicing in front of the mirror. The absolute executive power he craved, all of it was nothing but an elaborate fantasy. It had all been suspended by a single, fragile thread of trust from the very woman he arrogantly believed he could easily manipulate and outsmart. He had burned down his own life for a vault that was completely empty. The meeting dissolved into chaotic, frantic whispers among the legal teams. The board members began actively distancing themselves from Nolan, physically pulling their chairs away from him as if his impending ruin were a contagious disease. During the ensuing recess, while Nolan was cornered by his panicked defense attorneys, Eve walked quietly over to where I was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray city. "You handled yourself with remarkable clarity today," Eve said softly, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. "I simply stopped apologizing for seeing the truth," I replied, watching the traffic crawl on the streets far below. Eve offered a small, genuine smile. "When the dust finally settles on this wreckage, and it will settle exactly as we intend, I have a proposition for you. I intend to fully fund a new, entirely independent patient communication center. I want you to run it. Violet, I want you to use your exact talents to give a genuine voice back to the people this corrupt system has routinely used as decorative props. We are going to build something real from the ashes of his vanity." I looked at her, feeling a profound, solid grounding in my chest. The terrified, obedient wife was entirely gone. In her place stood a woman holding the reins of her own future. Across the expansive room, Nolan finally managed to break away from his lawyers. He looked across the polished mahogany table and locked eyes with me. The arrogance was entirely eradicated. The condescending superiority had been burned away. As he stared at me standing beside the most powerful financial backer in the city, the terrifying reality finally clicked into place behind his dark eyes. He finally understood the lethal magnitude of his miscalculation. He was no longer dealing with a domestic inconvenience. He was no longer fighting a bitter wife he could easily gaslight and dismiss. He was staring down the barrel of an airtight federal dossier, a cold and calculating living witness, and a spectacularly powerful benefactor who had just decisively publicly dropped him into the abyss. The day of absolute reckoning arrived with a breathtaking, suffocating velocity. It was neatly divided into two distinct, lethal executions. The morning was reserved for the formal, binding disciplinary hearing with the Arbor Vale Executive Board and the Foundation directors. The afternoon was scheduled for our final divorce mediation. Nolan walked into the grand Arbor Vale boardroom at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. He wore a brand-new, dark charcoal bespoke suit, the heavy fabric catching the cool morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His posture was perfectly erect, his chin held high, radiating that familiar, untouchable arrogance. He genuinely believed, right up until the heavy wooden gavel fell, that his unparalleled surgical statistics and his international medical prestige would effortlessly eclipse any administrative missteps outside the operating room. He walked into the room fully convinced that his sheer talent made him entirely immune to consequence. Mara systematically dismantled that delusional belief. She stood at the head of the heavy oak table and presented the chain of evidence in the exact agonizing order that Nolan hated most. She did not rush. She let the crushing weight of each document settle over the room. First, she projected the forged electronic signatures, laying bare the digital theft of my identity. Next, she mapped out the illicit cash flow funneling through Belframe Studio Limited Liability Company, tracing every single stolen dollar with undeniable clarity. Then, she displayed the damning late-night emails where he aggressively pressured the legal team to secure Eve's signature. Finally, she exposed the most sinister layer of his grand plan, the calculated, fully documented strategy to shift the entirety of the federal legal risk onto my shoulders. Nolan sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly jumped beneath his pale skin. He looked toward Eve Street. Claire, perhaps desperately hoping for a final, miraculous display of leniency or a sudden return on his years of sycophantic charm, Eve did not offer mercy. She stood up and delivered a short, freezing statement that effectively cut the massive room entirely in half. "The issue at hand is not how brilliantly Dr. Pierce operates in a surgical theater," Eve stated, her voice sharp and echoing off the glass walls. "The issue is that he has treated the profound trust of this institution, his patients, and his own family as nothing more than personal property, to be used for his own glorification and casually discarded when convenient. Integrity is not a surgical scrub you can simply wash off before you leave the hospital. The board's reaction was swift and devastating. They voted unanimously to suspend all public announcements of the new project tied to Nolan's name. They initiated a comprehensive, independent forensic audit of his entire department and immediately transferred his administrative file to the External Ethics Oversight Committee and Federal Compliance Council. The empire he built on my back was officially dead. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the venue shifted to the cold, modern offices of my legal team. The man who walked into the mediation room was entirely stripped of his morning bravado. Nolan slumped into his chair, the bespoke suit suddenly looking heavy, wrinkled, and ill-fitting. The condescending tone of the generous benefactor who had previously offered me a multi-million-dollar bribe to disappear was completely gone. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by the rapid realization of his own utter ruin. He had zero leverage left. He was forced to silently accept a dissolution agreement that was utterly devastating to his ego and his financial portfolio. He agreed to an absolute binding clause that completely erased any financial or legal liability I might face from his fraudulent campaigns. The asset division heavily favored me, securing my financial independence for the rest of my life. Furthermore, Mara successfully extracted a massive financial restitution penalty for his unauthorized, criminal use of my corporate entity. He sat there and signed his name over and over again on the thick stack of papers. I watched his legendary, heavily insured surgeon's hands trembling violently with every single stroke of the black pen. The collateral damage within the hospital was swift and merciless. Celeste Rowan, realizing her protective shield had evaporated, was quietly but immediately purged from the corporate hierarchy, her career entirely stained by the scandal. The grand expansion deal completely collapsed into dust. The glorious, highly anticipated public announcement of Nolan's medical monument was swiftly replaced by a brief, incredibly cold internal memorandum citing a necessary leadership restructuring within the surgical department. He was not just defeated, he was erased from the very narrative he had sacrificed everything to control. Several months later, the Boston air turned crisp with the arrival of autumn. I did not return to the suffocating social circles of my past, nor did I fade into the quiet obscurity he had originally planned for me. Instead, I opened the doors to Bell House Narrative Studio. It was a brand new, boutique communications agency specializing exclusively in ethical, fiercely honest storytelling for patients and transparent medical foundations. My very first round of seed funding, and my primary foundational client, came directly from Evelyn Street, Claire. She kept her promise to help me build something real from the ashes of his vanity. The final scene of my marriage did not feature Nolan begging on his knees in the pouring rain, nor did it involve me screaming in victorious celebration. True victory is much quieter, much more profound than that. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning in my new, sunlit office in the heart of the city. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air. I sat behind a beautiful, solid oak desk, running my hands over the smooth wood. I picked up my favorite fine-tipped pen and pulled a new consulting contract toward me. I smoothly signed the bottom line. It was my own name. It was my own company. I was no longer a ghostwriter trapped in the shadows, crafting beautiful lies to prop up a hollow man. Nolan had always believed that my silence meant absolute submission. He was too blinded by his own towering arrogance to understand one fundamental truth. Some women stay quiet, not because they are broken, but simply because they are listening closely, waiting for the exact, perfect moment when his empire begins to crack. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I would really love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below with your city or country so we can chat and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and empower even more listeners.